Nikki M. James stars in the musical Suffs on Broadway. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Nikki, I feel like everybody knows something about Ida B. Wells, the suffragist you play in the musical. But what did you find most surprising when you maybe dug deeper into research before you took on the role? Was there anything about her life and her work that most surprised you?
I think it's not, it's just the stark reality of all of the things that happen to this one person, and just like the level of clear-headed determination she had. She's really like tireless. There was a description that was in an earlier version of our show where Shayna used the word unflinching, which is the perfect word to describe Ida. She's just in the face of some really serious odds. She just has been really unflinching. One of the things that I learned early on is, we hear a lot about the the bus boycott with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, which caused the bus boycott in the 1960s. But Ida was sort of a participant in a very early version of a similar story. And that was new. That was happening very early in her life before she started really working in journalism, where she sued a railroad company for asking her to give up a seat that she paid for in what they were referring to as the ladies' car. And so she had these like, what's the word? Like the not elegant word is balls, like she just had this huge chutzpah. And then one of the ways that I've recently started to connect with Ida on a deeper level is that Ida was a mother, and she was doing all of her unbelievable work, starting the National Association of Colored Women, writing, traveling the world, working with the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, opening a center with her husband that was doing, you know, job training and all this other kind of stuff in her community while raising a family. And I'm a new mom. I guess not that new. My daughter is 18 months old, but raising an 18-month-old and opening a Broadway show is so hard. When I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning after getting home from tech at midnight, and I think of, just how much help and how exhausted and tired I am. I think of the work that Ida was doing and raising her family while doing her work, and I just am in total awe of her. And it's a connection I think we share. Yeah.
Yeah, it must be just an incredibly daunting task, but you do it so well. I mean, that's so apparent on the stage. And you've been with this show since the public run. I just
Sure.
wanted to ask you, what was the experience like doing it at the public and now doing it on Broadway? I know the material has changed. I don't know how much, the crafting of your character has evolved, but what was that experience like taking it from off Broadway to Broadway?
It's really, I actually, the first time I sang Wait My Turn was in 2018. So I've been involved in the development of this musical for a very, very long time. I think Jen Colella and I are probably the last Suffs standing here. We did a very early reading of probably the first 40 minutes. Many of the songs don't appear in Suffs anymore, but and I think it was called, it didn't even have a title. Maybe we were calling it The Suffragist or Suffragists. Shayna was playing around with titles, but the show has changed so much. Shayna has changed as a writer, as a human over the last 10 years since she, first had this read Jailed for Freedom, the autobiography that sparked the musical that would become Suffs. And the changes that she really made from the public to the Broadway run, which was a huge step, was taking away some of the recitative. So the public production, which in addition to being quite a bit longer than the production that we're doing on Broadway, there were fewer book scenes. There was a lot less spoken text. And Shayna, I think, really stripped away and like leaned into her inner book writer and stripped some of the music out. And I think by doing that, it's really highlighted the story. And then she continued to sort of mine the relationship between Ida and Mary, which is a really important one. Both their friendship and their conflict, I think, were really important to show in equal measure. And that's a thing that really took off since we closed to the public. We've done two. She did one longer workshop and another short reading in that time, in the 2 years. So it's hard to even talk about how much has changed, because so much has changed, and yet at the core of this story has not. This is a story about the determination and the friendship and the collaboration and the conflict of a group of incredible, powerful, flawed people who, you know, no small feat, changed the Constitution of the United States of America. It's not easy to do. We don't have that many amendments, do you know? So in a time, before the internet, before telephones, I think there were some telephones, but not everyone had them, like early days of radio. And it's like, it's incredible what they did.
Extraordinary. Let's dive into the song you mentioned, Wait My Turn, which it comes early in the show, but is such a standout moment. It's one of my favorite songs in the show. What is it
Thanks.
like for you as a performer to vocalize, the kind of injustice that's happening within, this really important movement that Ida is behind, but, she has to give voice to, just the inequality that's going on. It's such a great moment.
Yeah, and it's, I think, really, there is a version of this show in another universe, in an alternate universe, that like doesn't spend a lot of energy on the racism that was present in this movement, the women's suffrage movement in the 1910s and 1900s, and the women's movement in the 70s. There are movements about progress, and progressive movements are not without their flaws and without their demons, and people hold biases. People are willing to make compromises. One argument that Alice makes to Ida when she says, why I've been asked to wait my turn, it, Alice says, sort of, obtusely, she says, well, yeah, it's not me, it's the Southern women. And if we want their backing, like, we have to make this compromise. And what Ida says is like, I'm not going to co-sign this. You need to recognize what it is that you're asking of these Black women. You want our support, you want us to be behind you, but you want us to take a back seat and decide that your rights coming first are more important than all of us together. I think it's a really exciting moment in the show. It's really thrilling for me. It's my first time I step on stage. In earlier versions, I was in a few ensemble numbers. So it's really the first time I make an entrance, and it's maybe 20 minutes into the show, and the train is really running, and the girls are, the Suffs are out there being like, we're going to do it. How can we do it? And like, it's a lot of energy. And then all of a sudden it's just like a record stop. It's a reality check. And I think for the audience too, I think for me, it's like great dramaturgy. And what I'm proud about is that that's not where Ida's story begins and ends. Like we get to continue on with her throughout the piece. We have like check-ins with like what's going on with Ida. It's really something special. And I will tell you, it's difficult to do. It's difficult to do, when Alice says, you'll have to wait your turn in line, and I pause, and there's no music, nothing. And the audience, you can hear people be like, like everyone hears it at the same time. And as Ida hears it. And, and sometimes, you worry, a little tiny part of me worries that I'm going to come off being, too angry, that like stereotype that, for better or for worse, is, runs in the back of my head, or that the audience is, not here for that part of the story. I think about that too, which maybe I shouldn't be. But once I start saying these words that feel really true, they feel true for Ida in 1913 when she says it, and they feel true for me right now as a person of color in a world where, it feels like there's been an increase in prejudice and hatred for many groups.
Yeah, I think it's an extraordinary number. And I think, to your point, it is so necessary to the show. Like, this show would not be successful without those moments, your character the character of Mary, like they're so integral to the story
Yeah.
being told. So I absolutely agree. I want to ask you too about one of the ensemble numbers you're in, which is the March, because I think it's such an interesting moment where, Ida is, maybe wanting to be a bit rebellious in that scene before the ensemble number, and then you take part in it. But I wonder, do you play it differently than your cast members because of what Ida is bringing into the scene? I mean, it is such a powerful anthem, but how do you kind of negotiate?
Yeah, it's both. So, in the true life story, what Ida did was there were lots of compromises trying to be made towards the end to include everyone. The march was not exclusively segregated. There was integration happening in the college section where people were able to march with their colleges. And there were maybe a few other sections, but Ida was like specifically saying she wanted to march with their Illinois delegation. And at this time, like she had already started like her own like suffrage club. And she was like, I'm not standing in anybody's back. And so Ida was standing sort of on the sidelines, sort of mythically, famously, infamously. And then as the Illinois delegation, she just sort of stepped into line and then continued through the march. And I think that's what um that's what we're trying to theatrically portray here, is that like the march is going on and Ida, instead of sort of like falling in the back, decides to like file in but land herself in the front. And I do think I'm playing it probably a little differently than the other actors on stage, the other characters, because my boldness is in the face of both like the audience, the march audience being, the spectators, the men, women on the side, but my presence there is also meant to send a message to the women behind me. So like the performance of that moment for Ida is as much for the women here as it is for the spectators and the audience, right? So it's actually like sort of a 360 act of defiance. um yeah, it's really thrilling. But
Yeah,
of course she wants to be a part of it, and what she's saying is, I'm not trying to like be in a parallel line. Use me, like utilize me, involve me. I have access, I have gifts, I have experience. She's a number of years older than many of these women. I have fought big, she has fought many Goliaths in her life, and I think what she's saying is like, my presence here could be an asset and not a detriment. And the other women, at least in our story, and I'm sure if you do a little bit of research, you can find things that some of the suffrage leaders all over were saying about, the Black women, um, you know, that they were worried that including them would actually cause it to take longer to happen. So
it's amazing to me to hear that the original or earlier drafts didn't have as many book scenes, because I think your book scenes in particular are so powerful. And the one that
nice.
really stands out to me is once we hear that the amendment has been ratified, and there's some joy when Ida's told the news, and then there's an immediate kind of switch to know that,
Yeah.
well, yeah, that's great, but it's not going to apply to all women.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about that moment, because I feel like you let the audience feel Ida's joy. You give us enough of a moment to kind of well up with tears before we kind of hear the reality. So I just wanted to ask you about navigating that, because it's so you do it so perfectly. It's not overplayed. It's just so natural, but you let us kind of go through that journey with you. So what is
Yeah.
that?
Well, it's funny. It's like I try really hard not to play it out. I try really hard to be present in the moment, and that's like a moment where it, particularly in that moment where Nikki, the actor, the person, is as present as Ida. I think that moment is um it's the natural evolution. I mean, they've been fighting for this thing, how exciting. And that is thrilling. And then the reality sets in, like there's still more work to do. And for a modern audience, I hope all, if not all, but most of the audience recognizes that, um, you know, what Ida sees when she says they'll still stop our women from voting, and what she's seeing in her mind's eye is she's throwing herself forward. And what she's imagining is the truth that we know, is that there were going to be fire hoses, that there was going to be dogs, that there was going to be another march on Washington, in 40 years. This is 1920 is the suffrage amendment is passed, the 19th Amendment, and we don't get the Civil Rights Voting Act until I think it's 1965. So it's another 45 years of similar fighting. And this time, not wholly, but, the Black Americans are going to be doing it mostly on their own. They're not going to have the support of, potentially not going to have the support of some of the people that she's been fighting with up until this moment. It's all, everything about this show is, here are the things you didn't know about our own history, and here are the things that you do know, but you've been only really thinking about from one perspective. Shayna's doing a really amazing job of giving us different points of view without having to fictionalize almost any of it, because truth is stranger and more bizarre and heartbreaking than fiction can be in some instances. Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite moments, and it's also the part that I look least forward to doing. Hearing sniffles in the audience, hearing people catch their breath, realizing that we're on this one journey, and you think the show should end with the passing of the 19th Amendment, and we don't. We sort of, the show actually ends with an indictment, a prayer, a call to action, keep marching, to the audience. We're basically saying, this story is not over. The story is happening in this country and in countries all over the world. And this fight is worthy. And this right, the right to vote, is one that none of us can afford to take for granted.
Yeah, so powerful. And like you said, the end of the show is an incredible kind of anthem to continue to fight for a better tomorrow. Before I let you go, Nikki, I just have to ask you, this is your return to Broadway after I think about a decade as a performer.
Sure.
You've assistant directed, but how does it feel to come back to Broadway, to a Broadway stage, and specifically with this show? Like, this is a very special and unique project. So how does it feel to return with this particular show?
Oh gosh, it feels totally right. I'm super excited, first and foremost, to be wearing shoes, and not to be covered in dirt. And there's something really interesting. It's funny because people keep on saying it's 10 years, and I find that hard to believe because, God, it feels like just yesterday. But in those 10 years, I have been so expanded as a performer, doing classic work, Shakespeare in the Park, working on a Tony Kushner play downtown, directing and assisted directing theater, with my dearest friend and my I think one of the most incredible theatrical human beings on the planet, Michael Arden, and performing in and acting on television, and then directing television, and becoming a mother and getting married and all of these things. It actually feels really nice to be reintroduced to Broadway as a grown woman. I'd spent so many years playing ingenues and sweet girls or urchin girls or whatever. I've played many girls and I love them all. I love Nabulungi. I love Eponine. I love Lorraine from All Shook Up. I love all of those girls, but it feels really good to be a woman and to be able to be a more complete character in this show. There's some gravity, there's some weight, and I get to show off, some of the other colors of my personality and just who I've become. And then to be doing it alongside actors and and Shayna, who's a slash person, a multi hyphenate, and people who I honestly deeply respect and love. This isn't a job I got cast in and I showed up. I didn't go to an audition for this. I committed myself to Shayna and to Ida many years ago, and I've tried to show up for her in all of the ways that I can in order to make this show happen. Readings and singing the songs and concerts and Zoom sessions late at night about questions, and having really deep, thoughtful conversations about race and representation, and doing really like 360 work on this piece. And that's why it's really important to me. And I'm like, thank God this is the show that brought me back to Broadway. I couldn't be more proud to be a part of this show. You know, like I've had jobs and then I've had like jobs, and this is one of those.
Well, the effort is, the result is so apparent on stage. It's an incredible show and performance. Nikki M. James, excuse me, congratulations on Suffs.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Of course.